Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to The Post for Deaths of Despair. Not the most buoyant of topics, but this is our second instalment in our COVID quartet, where we're trying to understand why so many people are feeling distraught, desolate, fearful, and we're trying to move beyond an individual emotion and to understand the context and the environment in which we have survived and where I hope shortly we will thrive. It's my absolute pleasure today to talk about incredible research and indeed incredible researchers, inspirational researchers, and then we're going to take this research for a walk. So the goal today, I suppose, is to think about what is happening contextually around the word despair, what it means, and how we action trajectories outside of it. Now, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism was a book written by Angus and Angus Deaton, published by Princeton University Press in 2020. Angus is the Professor of Economics and Public Affairs Emeritus now at Princeton University, an awarded health economist. She's explored through her life the health consequences of injustice, with particular attention to fear and despair. Also, through a lot of her career, she's explored HIV/AIDS and the impact of intergenerational support in those communities. Angus Deaton is actually Sir Angus Deaton, a British-born economist who is currently the Professor of Economics and International Affairs Emeritus at Princeton University. He's a specialist in economic development, and he's placed a lot of attention in his career on poverty and inequality and the health consequences. And indeed, in 2015, he won the Nobel Prize for Economic Sciences, particularly for a lifetime's career investigating economics, inequality, and particularly the notion of welfare. He has remained interested in the world's poor and how all of us together can improve the lives of the world's poor. Angus is married to Angus Deaton, so we're exploring one of those truly wonderful, special and incredibly rare academic marriages, and that's quite important in a second too. Now, the story of this research, Deaths of Despair, is powerful and I think a model for all of us. In 2015, they published a paper, an academic paper, together with a remarkable title, Rising Morbidity and Mortality in Midlife White Non-Hispanic Americans in the 21st Century. Quite a mouthful of a title, but what happened was they were seeing an increase, a spike, in deaths in midlife by white Americans. And they started to see another variable being attached to that. Particularly those deaths in midlife were spiking from white Americans with less formal education. All right, so they produced this article, great article, and then they went, wow, there's a lot more to see and a lot more to talk about here. So the article became a book. And that's where we have this incredibly powerful title, Deaths of Despair. So Deaths of Despair referred to the deaths that were caused or reported to be caused by drugs, alcoholic poisoning, and also suicide. We saw it particularly through chronic liver disease as well. So their research showed that the mortality rates for Hispanic Americans and African Americans were not spiking. In fact, the mortality rates were going down for those communities. But for formerly uneducated white non-Hispanic Americans, mortality rates in midlife continued to climb. Okay, so as you've worked out, this is what they've described as the deaths of despair. A clustering of mental and physical anguish and the consequences of it. Now you'll notice, I hope, that the period through which they were researching this particular topic, it overlapped with the rise of Donald Trump. Indeed, the Washington Post and the Gallup poll demonstrated a correlation between support for Donald Trump and high death rates. Now remember, this is a correlation, it's not causal, we're going to come back to that in a second. Correlation from statistics describes an association between two variables, not much more than that. But these associations are useful because they can capture a predictive relationship. So we're not going to overplay this hand, but this is an important correlation for us to consider. And can I say it also builds on a correlation that I investigated in the book Trump Studies a couple of years ago. There was a correlation between the educational level of the voter and who they voted for in the 2016 election. And yes, the lower the level of formal education, the more likely the person was to vote for Donald Trump. And this correlation was only intensified when reading it through the lens of race. So white people who did not go to university were the Trump voters. Okay, so we've now got the frame for our discussion about deaths of despair. So Anne Case and Angus Deaton confirmed that while capitalism, the market economy, and noting the differences between those two phrases, while the market economy can be useful for managing a whole series of sectors of the economy, they have demonstrated it is not useful in managing health and health-based policies in a population. But like the best of projects, Anne Case found something really unusual in her preliminary research and couldn't work out why it was happening, and so she wanted an explanation. So what Anne found was a spike in suicide rates for white Americans in midlife. And this spike was not revealed in any other race-based population. And in fact, the elderly population, the health of the elderly population was actually improving. So as you can see, this is an odd variable to find. Why was it happening? Wow. Now you'll find in your life, I found in mine, some of the best research that ever emerges is when you see something odd and you ask yourself why. The why questions are robust and they give you momentum. So when following this odd information pattern, following these suicides, they discovered that the 3 fastest death rates were occurring in middle-aged white Americans in 3 areas: through suicide, drug abuse, and also alcoholic liver disease. Case and Deaton, upon tracking and verifying this data set, described that cluster as deaths of despair. Now, many of you are probably as uncomfortable as I am using the word uneducated. I really don't like that word because we're all experts in our own lives, and most of the population through history has been actively and structurally excluded from attending a university, either through a sociological variable or through a lack of pathways or simply the price of fees to attend a university. And I have always respected the life and the knowledge and the life skills of all humans. A university degree has absolutely no relationship to your value as a human. But let's track this variable. Let's look at the completion of a degree and its social consequences. Case and Deaton defined and tracked these deaths of despair for people without a bachelor degree. And remember, in the North American system, a bachelor degree is 4 years in length. So the division they focused on was the population that holds a 4-year degree and the population that does not hold a 4-year degree. And what their research demonstrated was the deaths of despair manifest in the population, the white American population, that does not hold a 4-year degree. But further, they showed a widening gap between those that hold and do not hold a degree, not only in terms of death rate, but in terms of the quality of their lives. Those without a degree experience a higher rate of mental anguish, anxiety, and physical pain. So Case and Deaton stated, quote, "A 4-year degree has become the key marker for social status," end of quote. So we hear so many justifications of higher education, you know, graduate outputs, we think about graduate outcomes, we think about industry-ready graduates, we think about the knowledge economy. But what we so rarely hear is the role of a university degree in health outcomes. This is a tragic story, and we learn so much about the failures of meritocracy from this story. Meritocracy is an ideology that we're all taught through our families, through school, through primary and secondary socialisation. You know that line, if we all just work hard enough, we'll be successful. If you work hard, you'll be successful. If you work hard, you'll be successful. Now the problem is, that's wrong. The meritocratic ideology is just that, an ideology. And I think we all know some of the hardest workers in our culture are on the minimum wage, and therefore there is no way they can get out of this low level, low salary environment to do something else. And what Case and Deaton confirm is that not going to university results in worse jobs, lower wages, reduced chance of marriage, and yes, deaths of despair, suicide, oxys, alcohol addiction. But I obviously want to log as well the remarkable research from Tyler Vegan, his brilliant and hilarious work on his website and in his book, Spurious Correlations, right? Now he shows that just because two variables exist doesn't mean they're actually related at all. He's based his career doing this great work. So for example, Vegan's shown a correlation between the number of people who die falling into a pool and the number of films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in. He's also looked at the correlation between divorce rates in Maine and per capita margarine consumption. So as you can see, just because something correlates doesn't mean there's any association at all. But I think the depth of Case and Deaton's research shows the scale of what is happening here and the new inequality that is emerging, the new divisions in United States society for white citizens, those who do and those who do not have a 4-year university degree. So they reveal the swirl of other economic and social transformations that are taking place, that endlessly seem to hook into this group without a 4-year degree. So the decline of wages in the United States has been particularly impactful on those without a 4-year degree. But the loss of permanent work, the loss of stable work, then has an impact on creating those routines and predictable patterns in our lives. I also wanted to log, if I can, the great research from Simon Winlow and Steve Hall. My respects, gentlemen. Their research in England, that was strongly presented in their great book, The Rise of the Right, shows what has happened to white working class men who are no longer in work. And their study meshes incredibly well with Case and Deaton's analysis. And why it's so robust is this research has happened in 2 different nations, but also using 2 very radically different methodologies. So what's going on? Well, of course, the similarity in the context between the United States and the United Kingdom is the global financial crisis. In both those nations, the global financial crisis impacted most on the least educated. It activated most on the working class without degrees. I'll tell you why. Because public money was spent to bail out the private banks, unemployment resulted, particularly for the white working class who were no longer in work. Then there is the decline in marriage and the rise of children being born outside of marriage. Now, trust me, I'm very well aware of all the critiques of the heteronormative, procreative marriage. I really, really get that. Trust me, I do. But Case and Deaton show, and this is unbelievable, the consequences of the decline in marriage on white working class men. Wow. They described this group as, quote, young men who thought they could live their life free of commitment found themselves alone and adrift in middle age. End of quote. So we have white working class men, not in work with the routines and patterns of a daily job, living outside of marriage, outside of a family life, and the connections and the community created through the family. And the results of all of this are deaths in midlife, a loss of hope, a loss of optimism that tomorrow might be better. Now, I obviously have to add one more variable to discussion as well, and that's, of course, the rise of oxys, the opioid epidemic. So what's particularly important, I think, is that poverty is not the cause of these deaths of despair, because the death rates of white Americans are far, in midlife, far ahead of the deaths of African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans. So, of course, all races confront poverty, but something is happening for the poverty that is experienced by white Americans. And that is what results in the deaths of despair. So let's invert the question. Why are we not seeing deaths of despair in the African American community or the Asian American community or indeed in the Hispanic American community? And the answer is, my word there, community. Through the bonds of family, of marriage, religion and faith structure, the deaths of despair do not emerge because relationships and communities are created. So those of you that may remember Robert Putnam's work from decades ago, best presented, I think, in his book Bowling Alone, can see how this type of argument is operating. So poverty is not a determinant of these deaths of despair. A lack of community, a lack of connection is amplifying the consequences of not holding a university degree. And that is emerging only for white Americans. This is extraordinary, just extraordinary. So therefore our next question is, what do we do about this? How do we manage, care for, engage with, stop these deaths of despair? Now let's start with the main one. The first thing we have to do is we have to lower the unemployment rate. We need to get people back into work. We also need to engage with that because that has social consequences, particularly, remember, for white men, because white men not in work are less likely to get married with all the relationships and community and engagement that exists through a marriage. So if we want to correct this situation, if we want to intervene in these deaths of despair, we need more jobs, good jobs. We need more work. And most importantly, we need to recognise the gift of education and ensure that as many people as possible democratically engage in and with higher education. This democratisation of higher education is absolutely crucial, not only for the knowledge economy and servicing the needs of industry, but for health. For health. Case and Deaton stated, quote, "There is a world of the more educated and there is a world of the less educated." End of quote. This statement made and makes me feel great shame. I've dedicated my life to education, to learning, to teaching and to research. But we now must radically rethink higher education, what higher education can do if we render it democratic. Every time we make policies or we vote for politicians who make policies about schools and universities, we have to recognise that those educational policies have health consequences. The life and death consequences of excluding some groups from education, that also excludes them from regular work and excludes them from marriage and deep and meaningful intimate relationships. So our economic and social system, our elitism, is killing people. So I wanted to summon right at the end of this vlog an amazing, deep and powerful statement from Carol Anderson, who stated, quote, "To someone who's always been privileged, equality begins to look a lot like oppression." End of quote. Big statement that. So what she means is citizens of colour, citizens with impairments and disabilities, migrants, trans community, non-binary identifying folk, Indigenous crew, our First Nations crew, and women have gained rights, visibility and cultural safety, and of course the right to attend university without oppression. Now these were and are hard-won rights, in many cases over centuries. So for those groups that have always had those opportunities, if they chose to take them, then the equality for others starts to look like they're being oppressed. So for white men who have not graduated from university, the work and the activism and the slog to study and get to university from women, from our Indigenous citizens, from non-binary identifying colleagues, the hard yakka that's involved getting to university for those groups is not read as equality, but as oppression. Now this is obviously not the case. As I've always said, saving the whales does not mean we kill the dolphins. But once more, I think we see the consequences of building up this us and them and scapegoating communities that have already had an historical legacy of oppression. Therefore, it's time that we have proper conversations about the future of work, a living wage, and the role of learning in citizenship and life. When we have those conversations, not only will those deaths of despair reduce, but will enliven our notion of communication, connection, and community. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tea out.